Alec Burks guarding him from the start. Wiggins again. Here's Curry for the record. It's good! And there it is! Stephen Curry!
The odds of this happening was 1 in a million. Hell, the odds of this happening, and this happening were 1 in a trillion. But before we put together one of the shiniest resumes of any pro athlete ever, we have to go back nearly 15 years ago because, well, none of this was supposed to even happen in the very first place.
The big question with Steph Curry is he hasn't played the point guard spot his entire life. When you look at the history of the NBA, just like in football and the NFL, most great quarterbacks played that spot from Pop Warner, 3rd, 4th grade on. Now, there are exceptions in basketball, players who've made that transition, but to do it at the highest level in the NBA, no easy task.
And, there he was excelling against virtual college players. It's going to be more difficult against real-life NBA guys.
Yeah, baby.
There was once a time Steph Curry had scouts worried about what position he'd play in the NBA, or if he's even a true point guard, but little did they know that Steph Curry wouldn't be a reason, he would be the reason for the advent of combo guards in the NBA. Here's an old scouting report of Steph Curry from April of 2009 that reflects precisely what the perceived weaknesses of Steph Curry were before entering the NBA. Through all the smart talk and the mumbo-jumbo of scouting is a very evident line of criticism that virtually every scout threw at Steph, and it was the notion that Steph Curry in the NBA would be nothing more than an elite spot-up shooter at best, and that he would never be able to carry an offensive load exclusively for an NBA team. Yeah, right. Actually, the scouts were right about one thing, and it was the fact that Steph Curry will shoot more shots from the three-point line than anywhere else in his NBA career. Well, almost, because 50.4% of Steph Curry's shots in his career have been from the three-point line, which is more than 11% more than even Ray Allen, who, even as a notorious spot-up shooter and as someone who was long considered the GOAT shooter before Steph, shot only 39% of his attempts from three compared to Steph's 50. That's an insane difference. And there have even been 2 seasons, the 2018 season and the 2021 season, in which Steph shot an absurd 60% of his shots from the three-point line, but these so-called experts saying that Steph would just be a spot-up shooter or someone with a ceiling of JJ Redick or Daniel Boobie Gibson was flat wrong even from day one for Steph in the NBA. In Steph's rookie season in 2009, he shot far more two-pointers than three-pointers. 67% of his shots came from inside the three-point line, while just 33% of his shot attempts were three-pointers. And the irony of this all is that Steph, at least according to what his numbers say, carried a greater offensive load in his first couple of seasons versus present day, even as a 30-point per game scorer, an efficiency prince in the back end of his prime in 2023. In 2009 and 2010, an average of 77% of Steph's three-pointers came unassisted, which immediately threw that narrative of him being just a standstill shooter right out the window because he was creating all of his shots alone. And Steph's buckets past his MVP seasons came off more assists compared to his earlier years. The scouts couldn't have been more foolish with this Steph Curry take, but maybe the most egregious take of them all came from former ESPN draft analyst Doug Gottlieb, who was sadly convinced that the soon-to-become greatest shooter ever wasn't even on the level of Johnny Flynn and Ricky Rubio. That, my faithful watchers, was atrocious.
You have guys like Jeff Teague, Johnny Flynn, Ty Lawson, who we expect to declare for the draft today, seen as guys with more upside. And then you have Steph, who's a spectacular shooter, but not a true point.
As recently as a decade ago, the NBA was all about big guys, tenacious wing players, and athletic guards, so it made sense for Gottlieb to use athleticism as one of Steph's biggest weaknesses and say that he wouldn't reach peak level because of it. I mean, to make matters even worse in hindsight, as for the reason why the Timberwolves chose to pass Steph Curry was that their idiot general manager was foolish enough to believe that picking Johnny Flynn and Ricky Rubio over Steph would give Minnesota 2 players similar to Hall of Famers Walt Frazier and Earl Monroe. Some people really get paid to do more of what they already have zero clue about, okay? I guess, look, what I'm saying As little did any of us expect that the game would shortly thereafter begin transforming into a guard-driven league pressed for shooters and guys who can hit 35-foot shots with hands in their faces. It's what I like to call the Steph Curry effect, and it started after we all had the privilege to watch arguably the most spectacular individual season of all time. No person left on earth disagrees that Steph is the greatest shooter in NBA history, but I don't think all of us can completely comprehend how one-of-a-kind Steph really is and how quickly he changed the sport we all love. In 2016, something revolutionary was happening in front of our very eyes, and the sport was rapidly changing from a game-to-game basis. And against all odds, the man who was responsible for such a rippling effect doesn't fly out of the gym like Mike, doesn't move with the graceful athleticism like Kobe, and isn't huge and ripped up like LeBron. He's just a 6'3" tall, light-skinned sniper with a baby face, and teams literally had no idea if there was anything on the face of planet Earth that could stop this man from unleashing the terror on the league that he was unleashing. You know how these scouts were saying that Steph was never going to be athletic enough to carry an offensive load or put a team on his back because he's too frail and skinny? Well, let me bring you the facts this way, because Steph Curry had arguably the greatest 10-game stretch, or roughly 1 month of basketball ever. In February of 2016, Steph Curry averaged nearly 37 points per game, 36.7, and shot 54% from the three-point line. He shot 125 threes during those 10 games, by far the most three-point attempts in 10 games in NBA history at that time, before he shattered his own record a few seasons later. In that stretch, Steph converted on 67 three-pointers, finishing with a true shooting percentage of 71 and tallied an offensive rating of 128. I know it's just 10 games, but a 71 true shooting percentage for a career should shatter the record for the highest percentage ever. Rudy Gobert is the all-time leader in true shooting percentage, and he hasn't shot anything outside of 6 feet in his entire career. Now, all that might just seem like a bunch of numbers to you, so how about I compare those numbers to a guy that was always labeled as one of the top 5 offensive powerhouses ever, Kobe Bryant. The late, great Kobe Bryant. Now, remember when he scored 81 points and played what we still remember as one of the greatest seasons of offensive basketball of all time in 2005? Well, Kobe's greatest month of basketball ever came in January of 2006. He averaged 43.6 points per game and tore up the league in a way that had folks convinced that he was really Michael Jordan with hair. But in terms of all the efficiency numbers, not even Kobe's greatest offensive stretch of basketball was nearly as good as Steph's 10 games of mastery in 2016. You get what I'm saying now? Kobe tallied an offensive rating of 122 compared to Steph's 128, had a true shooting percentage of 61%, and didn't even come close to Steph in the shooting splits department. Incredibly enough, those 10 games from Steph Curry rarely gets talked about, and it might just be the greatest offensive stretch of basketball we'll see, maybe ever. And not only did this babyface assassin, who supposedly would never be able to carry a team offensively, become the first player ever to record a season shooting at least 50% from the floor, at least 40% from 3, and at least 90% from the stripe, while averaging at least 30 points a night. He became just the second player in NBA history to average 30 with a true shooting percentage of at least 65%. The first time it happened since 1983, a league even before Michael Jordan. That's how prehistoric this record was. Now, this is to the extent that you'd imagine a future NBA Hall of Famer would be critiqued for his weaknesses. But ladies and gentlemen, Steph Curry's a rare case because he somehow became 100 times more than anyone could have ever saw coming. Perhaps the biggest and more unfair criticism of a young Steph Curry was that he takes too many bad shots and needs to improve his decision making. But guys and gals, what if I told you that a player made his career effectively off of changing the entire definition of what a bad shot in the NBA really is? Before the NBA we've come to know and love today, Three-pointers used to be far from what they are now. In fact, it was seen as more of a clown shot back in the 80s and even the 90s. Players only shot them when they truly had a wide open look or needed a three to tie or take the lead late in games. If we fast forward to 2012, the league had just 3 teams that attempted at least 30% of their shot attempts from three-point range. In 2017, a year after Steph's unanimous decision MVP season, the league made quite the shift in just 5 seasons, now having 17 teams that shot at least 30% of their shots from distance. But if we come to today, all the way to 2023, all 30 NBA teams shot more than 30% of their shots from three, with every team shooting at least 33% of their shots from three-point range, and with nearly half the NBA's average shot attempt being from at least 14 feet from the basket, which is a seismic shift in just a 10-year window that paints the entire picture of what the NBA prioritizes in the modern day in a player. Teams are now constantly looking for someone who can shoot it at all 3 levels with loud confidence. There's no such thing as a bad shot anymore, because all 30 NBA teams are shooting at least 1/3 of their shots from so far out from the basket anyway. And we can thank number 30 from the Bay for single-handedly changing the way teams draw up their bulletin boards on draft night in hopes of drafting the next player that can maybe enter the conversation of the best shooter ever. We can thank number 30 from the Bay for teams kicking guys to the curb and out of the league if all they can do is dunks and layups. While these scouts and analysts were almost 100% dead solid wrong about the player Steph Curry would become, it all makes for a pretty epic story that a skinny kid with peach fuzz became arguably one of the top 10 players ever, and not a shy, standstill shooter from the corner like most expected. Now, that's a mic drop unlike any other.